Good evening and welcome to tonight's Wednesday, January 14th, 2026 City Council work session on the budget. I'm going to pass it over to City Manager Conard to walk through the presentations. And as always, we will end with public comment at the end of this presentation and after the council questions.
Thank you, Your Honor. Welcome everyone tonight. Thank you for being here this evening. We have a two-part work session. The first part will include a budget conversation, and if it's amenable to the mayor and the council, we would take questions and answers for that section, and then perhaps take a break and head to the water sewer rate model study. So we have a great deal of information to share with you tonight. This is, as I mentioned, a two-part work session. No decisions are required or made at work sessions. We invite questions. We will offer answers as we have them, and we will record those items that we will need to explore through budget development and as part of the rate model study process. So first up is budget planning for the FY27 general fund budget, which Deputy City Manager Finance and Administration Nathan Lunny will take. And as part two, Al Pratt, our Water Resource Manager, will kick things off. So just as a point of reference, we like to include the vision and mission and statement of values, which are found on the City Council website, because we are deliberate about revisiting these principles of service to the community as we undertake the work of planning for another year of that service. So with that, I have one more thing to talk about. We held the City Council retreat this past weekend. It was a very productive conversation, and the day involved exploring common aspirations that the councilors had for the city and ability to identify their primary goals for the coming term. Those goals will be finalized and published shortly, and when available, they will provide direction for budget development at the departmental level. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Nathan.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Mayor, Assistant Mayor, Councilors. I want to step back before we talk about the FY27 budget and take a moment to do something we haven't done yet, which is to review the FY26 tax rate that was set in December. Some of that may be useful information or thought as you contemplate how to approach the FY27 budget, given some of the information that we'll share tonight. You can recall that the FY26 adopted budget was an increase of 3.47% over the prior year. That $5 million increase represented a 50-cent tax rate increase when compared against the property tax base that was in place in the prior year. When the DRA, the Department of Revenue, came and visited with us, they brought us $100,000 of new revenues. Nearly all of that was an adjustment in the meals and rooms tax. Still a pittance compared to what we send up to the state, but it was $95,000 or so more than we had anticipated. Those additional revenues generated a rate reduction of $0.01 on the tax rate. And then we had to make an increase, so we had to bump overlay to cushion against the anticipated abatements that are coming as a result of the revaluation. That generated another 7 cents, and so the projected tax rate impact would have looked like 56 cents. But both in the budget document that we prepared for you with our initial estimates, and then ultimately, there was new property growth. Ultimately, just shy of $200 million of new property growth, nearly 2% growth, and that generated a 23-cent reduction in that tax rate. So ultimately, your final tax rate change was 33 cents. That 33 cents was 2.95% increase in the tax rate year over year. I tell you this because, one, we haven't had a chance to talk about that publicly, and it's meaningful to let the public hear that and for you to consider that kind of analysis. But additionally, as you contemplate budget for another cycle, I think even though some of our neighbors have gotten in trouble anticipating without enough caution and care revenues and development growth of their tax base, I think that those are elements that you may want to consider this year and in years to come as you contemplate how do we address some of the challenges before us. What I'll talk about in the next few minutes is the fact that there's a small number of very large tax budget drivers that are going to be important for us. Next slide. First, let me just talk about the process, because part of it is to share with you the process to date, some of the things that we did a little differently this year as a result of, or in response to some of the realities we faced at the tail end of the process last year. In September, the city manager and I attended charter department meetings. We met with the school board and the police and fire commissions to just discuss initial budget planning. The idea was to give them some initial thoughts about how the process might play out, and the essence of our discussion was ultimately to suggest that all of the departments would be asked this cycle to draft a continuing services budget. Same programs, same people, new contracted cost as it would exist for FY27. And then, additionally, we encourage them to identify what their priorities would be if there was the opportunity for additions or changes in their programming, or what would their priorities be for reductions if that were to become necessary. Doing that work, I think, before we receive budget guidance from the council would make the process of developing a successful budget proposal more efficient and less stressful than it might otherwise be. The message that we communicated was, when we have guidance and have a sense of where we're headed, we'll then do the work of reconciling the continuing services budgets and your priorities with the reality of where we need to get the budget. So subsequent to that, the council adopted the capital improvement plan. That's huge because those are big tenets, big elements that underpin the non-operating portion of our budget and start us down the road to building the entire budget. Beyond that, I know that the departments, not just the charter departments, but all of our city departments were given the guidance to move forward with continuing service budgeting to make sure that we had that data in hand. Tonight, we're providing you with information so that in the near future, or in the near term, we maybe get some guidance from you. And then we'll share that with departments. The budget cycle will launch formally internally. We will see from the charter department requests. This will come after public hearings and public dialogue that each of those departments will host. And then finance will compile the budget data that we have and review requests as we seek to reconcile what we're looking at with what your guidance is. The city manager will work to reach those goals, and you'll see that budget book like you have in years past somewhere leading up to the end of April of this year. I want to remind you that the public is an important part of the budget process. There are a number of opportunities for public participation and input. Certainly at every council meeting between here and there are public comment opportunities. But as I said a moment ago, the charter departments each hold a public hearing. I believe the school department always holds two. I think they open their first one on the 27th of January in that Tuesday night meeting. Police and fire are 10 and 11 maybe of February. The schools have a second date, which doesn't come to me right now, but they open a second night of public hearing. The proposed budget will be introduced in early May, and as we have in the past, we anticipate that there will be multiple work sessions where we will work through elements of the budget. Each of those nights will include a public comment session, and there will be a public hearing, certainly in May, before we reach a hopeful decision in the month of June. That's the budget development process. So any great plan begins by knowing where you're starting. And so we're starting in FY26. FY26, as I said a moment ago, was a 3.47% increase over the prior year, FY25. This is in the slideshow for posterity. The current budget under which we're operating is $149,894,940. We'll talk about the operating and non-operating in a moment, but first, let me talk about economic indicators that we have used traditionally here in the city. For anyone that is new to the process, I'll tell you that the city's utilized the Consumer Price Index greatly. It has been a primary indicator that they've used for years to come, and I'll talk about that more in just a moment. But I can tell you that the Consumer Price Index November over November was released in the month of December, a couple weeks later than we expected. It came in at 2.77%. Social Security and the increase they're giving to their retirees on an annual basis is another metric that we pay attention to. That statistic came out, 2.8% is the Social Security change this year, starting for retirees in the month of January. So with that as a background, let's talk about the COLA that we use locally. In the city, as I said a moment ago, we've used CPI, the Consumer Price Index, heavily. We use it as a primary indicator, and in fact, the city has negotiated into nearly all of our master agreements with our union groups language that ties our COLA to the 10-year rolling average of the CPI. The 10-year average is here, calculated essentially on screen for you. You can see the past 10 years of the Consumer Price Index For FY '27, the 10-year rolling average is 3.03%. And that will be the city's COLA. It's included in our collective bargaining agreements. That will be the COLA that we'll use to build our FY '27 budget. For reference, I compared our 10-year rolling COLA, not the CPI, but our 10-year rolling COLA that has been implemented every year. And I'll remind you that some years the rolling COLA, the CPI might have been lower, but given that our collective bargaining agreements called for a floor of 2% and a ceiling of 5%, many of them, in some years where that calculation was slightly lower than 2%, we used 2%. So even respecting the amount that we did in fact use as the COLA, so in some cases 2%, our 10-year average is 0.5% lower than the Social Security Administration change for its retirees year over year. Our 10-year is 2.61% versus the 3.11% of Social Security. I thought that was informative. For some, that will be, hey, the 10-year rolling average really helps us. For others, it will be, hey, we're not taking care of our employees even as much as the Social Security Index is managing. So whatever your flavor, I thought it was important information to do the analysis and share. So with the economic indicators and some sense of COLA behind you, let's talk about the budget itself that we'll build. The larger portion of the budget is our operating budget, and the operating budget is essentially where all of the departmental programming and services are budgeted. I use that as generalities. There are certainly some exceptions, but essentially the operating budget includes all of our costs related to human capital. It's our pay and benefits. It includes professional services that we contract for. It includes our supplies and materiel for the work that is done in service to the community. It represents 82% of the current total budget, and that's a metric that has been consistent at least for the last couple of years. The highlighted items here I'm going to talk about in a slightly greater detail. So the first of those is health insurance. So big budget driver number one, health insurance this year. It's an enormous driver. I can tell you that health insurance is for us a collectively bargained benefit. Claims and costs are rising across the country for many. It's a reality regionally in our health pools, and it's a national reality this year as well. The city contracted with a benefits consultant to explore options, working to control costs and ensure stable coverage. What we have learned is that there are a number of options for us, and we'll continue to pursue, become educated, and execute on some of those options as we're able. And positioning of the city to be prepared for some of those changes will be really important. We've also learned, though, that there are limitations, and one of those is that our claims in the school department are dramatically higher this year than they have been in recent years. The school department faces a 26.2% rate increase, an increase that'll cost nearly $3 million in new health dollars. All of the other city departments working through a different provider, they'll average a rate increase of 11.4%, but even that adds up to roughly $800,000 in new cost. So collectively, that's over $3.7 million, and $3.7 million all by itself represents a 2.5% budget increase in the entire budget for FY '27. So that's big budget driver number one. I just got done talking about COLA. Our COLA is 3.03% based on the CPI. This is big budget driver number two. To understand the order of magnitude, we put together some numbers. These are just estimates. This is not final data, but it considers everything related to contractual obligations of our employees in terms of compensation. So step increases where they're available, changes in longevity, and other compensation benefits that are included in our collective bargaining agreements. It also includes an estimate of the payroll-related taxes and our New Hampshire retirement system contributions for eligible employees. This does not take into account, I wanted to make sure I called out, any proposed staffing changes, adjustments, or reductions like those included in the initial budget presentation made by the school department last Tuesday night. So these numbers are higher than what you might see in another presentation. This was just an illustration to give you a sense of where the costs related to staffing based on current staff and the collectively bargained COLA of 3.03% might drive us. And ultimately, it's an increase of roughly 4%. $4 million is what I meant to say. $4 million, as consistent with what I said a second ago, is 2.7% budget increase over the FY26 budget all by itself. Big budget, number two. Big budget driver, number two. Not so much to drive budget, but just to inform you, the city works right now with 16 collectively bargained agreements with 16 union groups. 5 of those unions have contracts that will be expiring June of 26, so the end of this fiscal year. The FY27 budget will need to anticipate the costs related to fund those. We do so by budgeting a contingency that helps provide funding that we can transfer in after those agreements are settled. In FY27, it's important to know that employees of any unsettled contracts will receive steps, but they won't receive any COLA adjustment. So a 4-year employee might see a 5th-year step increase. That will be budgeted. But if that employee is working with a union that has an expiring contract, those dollars would not be attributable to the particular department where that employee is working. They would instead have to be covered by whatever contingency that we budget. Those are the big movers, if you will, in the operating budget. The smaller portion of the budget is the non-operating side. Non-operating budget makes up 18% of the proposed budget ultimately. It includes elements from our capital planning, the CIP, including debt service, which is principal and interest payments ongoing against outstanding bonds. Capital outlay, which is our pay-as-you-go current appropriations mechanism for capital spend, and also technology, equipment needs, cloud-based tools. CBITA is an accounting reference that has invaded our budgeting process. Subscription-based information technology arrangements. So much of what we do, our innovation is cloud-based. It's software, but it's subscription as a service as opposed to the purchase or acquisition of code for local implementation. This is subscription-based. We account for it separately, so we're recording it in the budget now in a way that we can track it and make transparent reporting, I should say, of it. Also, in non-operating, our property and liability and our county tax. County tax, we estimate, will probably be up 4%, but I haven't even calculated that in any of the numbers tonight. Those are things that we'll confront as we get going. There's a couple of items there that are highlighted, and in the next couple of slides, let me talk more to those. First of those is debt service. I wanted to just remind folks, especially anybody new to the process, that the city has recognized in the last several years by the Governmental Finance Officers Association for the work that we do, including financial management practices and policies. Additionally, when Standard & Poor's has issued the last couple of AAA bond ratings, they've made comments about the strength of the financial management planning practices and policies that are in place in the city. One of those is our debt service policy. The policy directs that we should not use more than 10% of annual appropriations to make payment against our net debt service. Straight from the CIP that was passed in December, the projection right now is that our net debt service as a result of the bonds that are out there would be 8.04%, so certainly staying within the 10% policy limitation. Second of those policies is capital outlay. Capital outlay, as I said before, is our pay-as-you-go. These are general fund appropriations in the year. The policy calls for us not to budget more in capital outlay than 2% of the prior year's appropriation. And in this case, the FY27 capital outlay coming from the approved capital improvement plan would sit at 1.3%, a dollar amount of $1.95 million. Neither of those is sacred necessarily, although you as a council in the previous 6 months have done the work, 4 months have done the work to approve the CIP that staff had presented. And so we'll have to talk about elements of either debt service or capital outlay that want to be deferred for a later period as we contemplate meeting the budgetary challenges this cycle. So I'm moving rapidly, I hope, towards a summary. It's not a great summary. But if I take what we've just talked about, the $3.7 million of health insurance representing about 2.5% budget increase year over year, COLA on our salaries and wages, driving a $4 million increase, that representing 2.7% more. And a number I didn't give you a second ago, but I'll just plug and say the debt service changes, the capital outlay, the information technology, equipment, et cetera, those dollars right now look like something about $2.2 million. And again, that's manageable and workable, but that right now would represent 1.5%, which would take us to, I shouldn't characterize this and move you in a direction, but it'd take us to a staggering $10 million, which is measurably larger, twice what we saw as a budget increase last year. That's a 6.7% budget increase. And this is not a budget. We haven't built a budget. We've just picked 3 large drivers to give you some perspective on where we stand. Certainly we could work on this, but this doesn't take into account any of the other contractual commitments in terms of service contracts to maintain the elevator, or you name it. If I picked any number of maintenance items, none of the contract requirements built in and escalators in any of those agreements, none of those have been considered. So we're at 6.7, a number that could be larger. And I look to you, I consider the tax conversation I had a moment ago about how the budget and revenue change and property valuation changes drove a tax rate change in December of '25. Maybe you consider that as you contemplate what are the priorities and how do we reach towards the tax rate setting for another year. How do we address the budget? We'll be working on revenues that we can identify, changes there. We certainly appreciate that there's continued property development in the community, but we stand ready to do the hard work and contemplate what your priorities are working on the FY27 budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. We'll take questions on this before we move on to the water sewer rate model study. So, Councilor Miller, so your hand first.
I have a question, because when we're starting to talk about the value of property and how the increase that covered and lowered the tax rate, but I just want to make sure we're talking about the date of, as of April 2025 would have been the date that would have been. So as whatever was completed on the tax rolls then. So we basically have to now look at April 2026 for the next one, which we won't really know. Okay.
Right. Those are not numbers that you know today.
Right.
I mean, obviously, some of those numbers have become real over the course of the time in between, but neighboring communities, other communities in the state have been less careful than I expect we will be in terms of revenue estimates and development estimates. I would never want to see Portsmouth in a situation where we had overestimated and then suffered for that later. So I'm very careful as I suggest to you that we consider all of those elements, but given the challenges that I already see, I wanted to make sure that we talked about all of it.
And if I could ask one more, do you have an estimate on what the contingency for collective bargaining is going to be this year?
No.
That's a simple
No,
answer. It's fine.
no.
I just wasn't
mean,
sure if we'd gone
yeah,
down
it's-
that road.
It will not be as great. It will not be what last year's was.
Okay.
It will be less than that. We have smaller unions involved. So
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Tabor.
Thanks, Mayor. So we have a healthcare stabilization fund to a reserve for large increases like this. Can you describe what kind of relief we might be able to get out of the stabilization fund for this big school care and Anthem increase?
absolutely. So the stabilization fund finished FY25 with a balance of just about $7 million. Our projections, I should back up. I don't want to take too much time, but I should back up and say we have traditionally budgeted based upon our health insurance stabilization reserve and policy. We have budgeted with another 10-year rolling average. We take a 10-year rolling average of the rate increases separately in the school care Cigna program that is run for the schools today and the Health Trust Anthem coverage that is provided to other city departments. We work with a 10-year rolling average. That's the amount, as a result, that we budget for. All of those dollars are transferred into the stabilization reserve, which then essentially pays the bills. And if what we budgeted and contributed is greater than our actual spend, then the reserve fund benefits. But if what we spend is greater than what we had budgeted and put in the fund, then the fund suffers. We expected or projected that this year the fund would suffer by nearly $1 million. So we expected in our projections that we would finish FY26 with less than 7 million, something closer to 6 or $6.1 million. That fund, that stabilization reserve, was established to do exactly as the councilor suggested. We have a couple of concerns. One is the policy carries with it a caveat that we should not use more than 25% of the corpus of the fund in any given cycle. And so as we talk about the total dollars, if we landed at 6 million at the end of this fiscal year, as we look to next year, 25% only leaves us $1.5 million to deal with what looks like a $3.7 million problem. Additionally, the second concern is that we are working with a consultant now and contemplating the savings and efficiency and improved coverage that we might find by configuring ourselves differently, self-insuring direct with carriers like an Anthem or a school care, a Cigna, excuse me. And in all cases, anybody, whether you are fully insured or self-insured, any of the variables that we might consider would necessitate carrying a healthy reserve. Most communities, even close to our size, even some larger, are many, many years away from considering that as a real alternative, simply because they first have to build up a reserve that makes them able and situated to manage the flows of transactions that you would have year over year. We're in a far better space if we end up draining significantly this fund, this reserve. It postpones our ability to move in that direction. So we want to balance that as a priority as well.
And just to follow up, would we look at, as an alternative to self-funding, maybe some level of major liability, catastrophic coverage, and then self-insuring the rest?
A portion. All of that, yes, is on the table with the consultant. I mean, they're starting, right now their analysis has moved to more acute concern as we contemplate what to do for fiscal 27. Because I mentioned a 26.2% rate increase that the schools are seeing, the research they've done doesn't suggest that we are in a strong position, so that doesn't look like it gets better, as we contemplate alternatives. But the other city departments are in a far better space. So they've been focused right now on where to be July 1. But your suggestion is certainly among those that we contemplate for future years.
Well, kudos to you all for really, this is the big elephant in the room, this one increase.
Yeah.
And so kudos for looking at all available ways to mitigate it,
On that,
change direction.
just quickly on school care, and Councilor Cook had the floor. The $7 million projected down to $6 million. Can you explain what is made up, how that, I guess, pot was created? Was it money back from school care? Was it tax dollars? Can you shed any light on how we've kind of put that pot together?
The timing, in my read and research of it, the timing of it suggests that there was foresight in years before there were any significant dollars that came back from the pools. The dollars that came back from the pools were shared appropriately with employees, either through reduced subsequent rates like we do now, or dollars being shared with them appropriately like we do with retirees that are contributing and not able to benefit from any rate reduction. But so the program was started and the reserve was established some number of years before. The dollars that came down, dollars of significance in the, help me, who am I looking at, 10, 11, 12, 2011, 12, 13 maybe timeframe, those dollars certainly boosted the reserve, but that reserve has been in place for closer to 20 years. So it predates any of those big dollar additions. Again, as I suggested, each year from whatever starting place, they contemplate what the 10-year rolling average is in terms of rate increase, and that's the budget increase that we realize in all of the relevant departments, water, sewer, school, general government. We budget for police, fire, we budget for and contribute, and then if we spend less, then the corpus of the fund grows. If we spend more, then the corpus of the fund falls as a result. And in many years, if you look back over the history, there were surpluses, if you will. More dollars were budgeted than were ultimately spent. And this is not dramatic swings generally. It's there were a different election of single, two-person and families in the changing demographic of staff. We had different elections and different spend than were budgeted or expected. I will tell you though, over the years, one of the things that we need to fix about this is that changing staff headcount was not always factored in. It was the prior year budget that was adjusted by the 10-year rolling average of rate change, not taking into account any measurable change in the population being served, which in the case of the school department has led the school department to be upended. So the budget each year doesn't reach the level that is actually spent. Not so much the case in some of the other general government departments, but if you were to look at the analysis over the course of the 20 years, there are pluses and minuses each year, different departments. It depends on the demographics of the ages. We have, can I name it? If I said the fire department is filled with a greater youth right now and maybe fewer families than it did a decade ago. And so as a result, the costs are different. If you budget still based upon the prior year with a rate change, you end up with a surplus, and that supports the corpus of the fund. I hope that hasn't been confusing. I've talked too much. That should have been 2 sentences, but get another good one for me, Mayor. I'll talk all night.
Councilor Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for the presentation. Of course, the news is not positive, and so I have a question around that and how we'll be approached with the budgetary numbers when they come back to us. Clearly, we have to find some place to cut some costs, otherwise the tax rate is going to increase pretty significantly. When you come back, can you bring back numbers that give us an indication of what it looks like if people retire or leave and we don't replace them, but also what services we're losing in that process so that we can make an educated decision about not replacing individuals or losing those positions, which would clearly decrease our obligation financially. But the reason I'm asking this is that I know everyone is, if you're like me, you're really disappointed that the library closes a little earlier. And some of that is we didn't replace a position. So it's good to know what we're losing by not replacing. And so we can do a real trade-off, just have a real trade-off discussion on cost.
Absolutely.
Understood.
Any other questions before we use or move to the water rate?
Does it make sense to hear from the various boards and commissions, committees that are here?
Oh, sure. Do we have?
We made a deliberate effort to invite the members of the school board and fire commission and police commission here so that all groups affected by the budget would hear the same budget preview message.
So would we want to ask questions? Is there any statements that are to be made at this time? We can also, don't want to, we're going to get into public comment, so we can wait into that, but we could suspend the rules in the agenda and have public comment here and then after the water sewer, if that's easier, if folks don't want to stick around for after the water and sewer conversation. All right, so we'll open it up to public comment now on this, and then we'll have a separate public comment on the water and sewer. So public or department head, if there's or commission member. Not all at once.
Like crickets in the room.
Okay.
Nobody? Nobody? Okay.
All right, so nobody's rising. Again, if, we're gonna go on to the water sewer rate model study. When we get to public comment, at the end, if you'd like to talk about this, happy to. All right.
Just really quickly, Mayor, I make my apologies to the council that this didn't reach you beforehand. We've been working to come up with the best numbers that we could. This will be uploaded to your iPad so that you'll have it. It will be posted into the meeting calendar to join the agenda for this evening. All of that will happen tomorrow morning so that folks will have the benefit of this information moving forward.
Thank you, Nathan. All right.
Counselor Bagley.
Oh, Councilor Bagley.
Thanks, and I just wanted to make a comment on that because we get that question a lot, why aren't materials available sooner in the meetings? And just acknowledge the hard work that goes in, like right up until the meeting, the minute starts, to create all of this data and put these presentations together, which are not easy to do. So I think sometimes there's this misunderstanding that all of this stuff has been created weeks ago and we're waiting to present it, but you guys are working hard to create this information for us right up until the meeting starts quite often.
Thank you.
So thank you, Your Honor. Part 2 of the work session involves a conversation about our water and sewer rate model study. So first up will be our Water Resource Manager, Al Pratt. He will be joined by Senior Principal of Stantec, David Hyder. But we'll start with Al. Welcome, Al.
Thank you. Good evening. So this is the first work session for the Water and Sewer Enterprise Fund rate study. Back in November, the rate study was introduced to City Council at sort of a high-level overview of what the rate study process is and its real intention and the reason why we were doing the study. Tonight, we are joined here by Dave Hyder, who is a senior principal at Stantec, and Stantec is the consulting firm that we contracted with to conduct this rate study. So after my brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Dave to get into the details of what they found so far with the rate study, looking at the data and sort of current fund status analysis. So the goal of this meeting is really to provide you with the fundamental understanding of the rate study process. Rate studies have a certain standard process that's outlined in American Water Works standards. So that's the process that they're following. And it's also to provide you with the preliminary findings up to this point in the study. One thing we will not be doing tonight is getting into any details on any changes to rates, any changes to rate structures, or changes to fees. We're not going there tonight. The plan is we will have the next work session where we can really take the time and come together with a clear plan and options for different rate structures and different rates as we're working through that, as we're still working through those numbers with Stantec now. So a good part of the meeting tonight, if there's any input that you have, any considerations that we want to take in to prepare for that next work session, they're very welcome. And I will start with just a brief overview of what is an enterprise fund, just so we're all on the same page. Enterprise funds, the water and sewer enterprise funds are established to manage the finances of the water and sewer utilities. All the revenues for these funds come from the water bills, the water fees directly associated with providing the water and sewer services. There are no fees that come into the enterprise funds from the general fund. I want to make that clear, that there are separate funds managed separately from the general fund. So sewer, the next slide shows the water and sewer revenue does pay for operational costs as well as our capital improvement costs. Firstly, just want to go over the operational costs. Our system is very extensive, starting with our surface water reservoir that's located 12 miles away from here. Water goes through pipes all the way from there down into the city. We have 2 water treatment facilities. We have over 190 miles of water distribution system, the reservoir, 10 wells, a lot of infrastructure that we're managing. On the wastewater side, similarly, we have 2 wastewater treatment plants, over 100 miles of collection systems, 22 pumping stations. Again, a lot of infrastructure, and all this infrastructure is running 24/7. So a lot of costs go into our operations just to manage the day-to-day. Capital improvement projects. So A large component of our capital costs are driven by regulatory requirements, especially over the past 10 years. So the wastewater plant at Pierce Island, that was a major expense that is now we are paying off slowly. Newington Booster, we did an upgrade at the Newington Booster Station to manage disinfection byproducts, another regulatory requirement. And PFAS is ongoing. As you'll see in our capital outlay now, we have PFAS projects in that is a big component of our costs. So with all this infrastructure going on, so point that I wanted to make, in our existing CIP, the FY27 capital improvement plans, a little over 74% of the costs in that plan are associated with either regulatory or critical infrastructure, such as the Mechanic Street pumping station and the transmission main under Little Bay. Those are critical infrastructure nearing end of life. They need to be done. So they're part of that 77% load of our capital costs coming down. The 23% remaining we list as priority projects. They're projects that are in the capital outlay. If they're not done in this window, they may potentially become emergency projects, which will cost more money. So I just wanted to put that out there because there's the revenue side of things, which we're handling with the rate study and looking at ways to collect that revenue to pay for these capital projects and our operations. But there's also the expenditures and our capital investments. And I just wanted to put it out there that we are systematically prioritizing our capital projects. And that'll be a point in our next work session if you'd like to delve more into how we're managing our capital costs. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dave Hyder, who is, again, the senior principal at Stantec in their financial management group. He has helped the city for many years developing our rate model and managing our enterprise funds.
Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Al. Well, good evening, councilors, mayor. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Dave Hyder. I'm with Stantec, and I'm going to take you through the preliminary findings of the rate study. Then we look forward to coming back with some specific recommendations. Just to start off in terms of why we're going through a rate study, kind of some goals and objectives for the rate study. The first one is we want to update the rate model to assure that we have financial health and stability and predictability within the city's water and sewer enterprise funds. So what the rate model is it's essentially a financial tool that we look at to forecast revenues and expenditures on the system. So we're testing all the assumptions within that, making sure that it's providing an accurate forecast going forward. Closely related to that is we want to come up with a plan that supports and ensures the adequate net position within the enterprise funds. And so net position is really a reserve, a cash balance, having some funds set aside to make sure that you have sufficient funds within each of the enterprise funds. We're also looking at appropriately pricing water and sewer service based upon the cost of providing service. So historically, over the last several years, we've just increased rates across the board. Now we're looking at how we actually structure those rates, the fixed charges, the usage rates. So looking more at the pricing versus just the overall revenue needs. And then we're also balancing the rate and fee structures in terms of what does it actually cost to provide service to different customer classes. And that's included in the analysis. So just to start off, give you a bit of a preview of our initial findings. We have found that the current water and sewer revenues are not sufficient to meet the current or projected expenditures for each of the funds. And as a result, we are going to be recommending that rate adjustments will be required to ensure the stability within each of the funds. So we'll go through that this evening. In terms of the cost of service results, we are showing that there's a modest misalignment between the cost to serve the various customer classes. So when we look at commercial versus residential versus industrial, there's a little bit of a misalignment there, but it's within industry standards. But again, we'll go through that. And then the final key finding is that your revenues from your fixed fees, you currently have a water fixed fee, is generating revenues well below industry standards. So again, I'll highlight that. Okay. So a little bit of background just in terms of what we're seeing nationally, as well as these issues and challenges are facing the city of Portsmouth as well. Over the last 20 years or so, we've seen an ongoing decline in the amount of water used on a per account basis. And as people use less water, it's great from an environmental perspective, but it does directly hit your revenues on the system. We're also seeing, obviously, that we need to take care of our infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure that was built in Portsmouth, as well as around the country, is decades and decades old, so we're having to replace that infrastructure. Estimates are in the trillions nationally that we need to reinvest, so that's a big driver for cost. You obviously have regulatory requirements, whether that be PFAS or the lead and copper rule, so that's placing pressure, particularly on the capital side. In terms of to address these issues, we have seen customer bills increase at a greater level than incomes, so there's a challenge of affordability. Also, you have aging workforce, so it's more difficult to find folks that want to be within this industry, so challenges associated with that. And then most recently, we've seen some pretty significant increases in costs. The input costs, whether it be commodities, construction, things of that sort, due to COVID and the inflationary factors, we've seen some pretty significant increases. And just to drive that point home, on the next slides, I have a couple examples. These are just pulling some of the commodities that are related to providing water and sewer service. When we look at the National Commodity Index for plastic water pipe, from really, it was basically 21 to 22 or 23, we saw about 132% increase in the cost of plastic water pipe. That has a direct impact on water service. Also, water treatment chemical index went up about 31% over that same period of time, so that's putting a lot of pressure on utilities. On the next slide, just some construction costs. This is driving your capital improvement plan. General construction's up about 33% over the last several years. Industrial construction up about 40%. So in general, what we've seen is obviously these increased costs. We're not continuing to see those costs go up, but they're staying at those elevated levels. So that is putting pressure in terms of the cost of providing water and sewer service. So now I want to take you through the rate study process, and there's really 3 key steps that we go through and help define what's included. So the first step is the financial plan, and that's really defining how much revenue do we need to collect, given our expenditures both now and over a projection period. The next step is the cost of service, and that looks at from whom are we collecting those revenues, what does it cost us to serve residential versus commercial versus industrial customers. And then the final step is how do we actually collect it? What's our rate structure? You currently have a water fixed charge, and then you have tiers within your usage rates. We're examining how do you actually structure the rates. Does that still make sense, or there's some modifications that should be made? So going through the financial plan, these are the steps that we look at with the financial plan, and this is really housed within that rate model that I talked about earlier. We're developing a 10-year projection period for the Water Enterprise Fund and for the Sewer Enterprise Fund. We do that in 3 steps. The first step is looking at the revenue requirements. So what does it cost today to provide water service? What does it cost in 10 years? And what does it cost for sewer service? That includes your operating cost, your capital costs, any existing debt payments that you have, and that just defines what the costs are in the system. We then compare that with a revenue forecast. So what are we anticipating your revenues this year and into the future? And then we compare the two. Are we covering our expenses? If we're not covering our expenses, are we able to maintain cash balances if we're eating into those cash balances? And so we can evaluate those key metrics. So next slide. So in order to provide that projection and that forecast, we have to make some assumptions. We're using fiscal year 26 budget as our starting point for the expenditures. And then the financial model looks at each of those expenditures on a line item by line item basis, and we apply an inflation factor to give us that 10-year forecast. You also have existing debt service, number of issues. That amortization schedule, those future payments are included in the forecast. Your current payment in this fiscal year for water is $5 million. Your current payment for sewer is $12 million. And then you're paying that debt off over time. And then another big driver is the capital improvement plan. So we were given a 7-year capital improvement plan. That includes projects for water, about $76 million in total, and sewer projects, $76 million in total as well. The plan is that that capital would be debt funded. So you'd borrow to finance that going forward. So next, just in terms of revenues, we have to make some assumptions in terms of revenues on the system. So for all the non-rate revenues, so not user charges, we're again using the budget as a starting point. We're forecasting that forward. The majority of them we're keeping flat at this point in time, but we are evaluating. It will come back with recommendations for hydrant charges and fire line fees and things of that sort. So that will be factored in. In terms of customer growth and consumption growth, we are assuming 1% increase in both consumption and customer growth going forward. That's been the trend over the last 5 years, but that is trued up annually as we evaluate how folks are using water and growth in the system. Finally, in terms of the last assumption, is just the capital improvement plan. So this is, again, that $76 million for water, $76 million for sewer. You can see in each of the fiscal years the amount that's programmed. And then down at the bottom, just some of the notable projects or the bigger projects for water. A big one in 2029 is the Portsmouth and Collins Well, $13 million. For sewer, the biggest one, I believe, is the Pease wastewater treatment plant upgrades, $20 million in 2029. So again, all those projects are assumed to be debt funded. So next we can bring forward and look at a forecast. So this is the forecast of those revenue requirements over that 10-year projection period. So again, we're starting at fiscal year 26, going out to 2035. The different bars just show the expenditures and different types of expenditures. So the blue is your operating and maintenance costs. That's the day-to-day operations of the water system. The green is that existing debt service. So bonds that you've borrowed in the past or loans, you have to pay that off. You can see that is being paid down over time. And then the red bars are essentially that funding that $76 million, issuing debt to fund those capital improvement projects, and you can see how that grows over time. We also just have some other expenditures, that's rolling stock, things of that sort. Final component is the line, which is the projected revenues, water revenues on the system. And that projection, that black line, is essentially based upon some historical increases that we'll talk about in a little bit. But that's the anticipated increases in revenues that we had talked about historically. The delta between the line and the bars is whether you have a surplus or a shortfall. You can see in each of these years we're forecasting with that current revenue projection a shortfall, ranging from about 0.9 million up to about 1.7 million in fiscal year 32. So this just demonstrates that the revenues are not forecasted to cover the expenditures going forward. Next slide. One of the key items before I show some results here is just to talk about net position. As I mentioned earlier, net position is reserves that you have within the fund. Net position is very important. It's essential for providing a sustainable utility. Some of the items that it provides is really operational liquidity, so make sure you have funds to pay the bills as your revenues are varying within on a monthly basis. It also helps you manage that revenue volatility in terms of if you have higher billings in the summer because of irrigation and lower billings in the winter, things of that sort. It provides some emergency response. If there's some failure in the system, you have cash that's immediately available to address it. And ultimately, if you have adequate net position, it provides some rate stability. So if we are seeing that our expenses are going up, we want to eat into that net position a little bit. We don't have to raise rates quite as much. So long term, it provides that rate stability. Industry standards to have about 30% set aside in net position, so 30% of your annual expenditures, which would be about 3 to 4 months of your annual expenditures set aside in net position. So this is the forecast for the water system in terms of net position. So if you remember back to the prior slide, we were looking at those shortfalls. What this slide here on the right shows with the graph is your current projected end of year net position for water. We're going to be positive. But with these forecasted revenue increases that are shown in the table, we are anticipating that you would drop below. You'd basically have negative net position beginning in fiscal year 27, and that would continue to go more negative as our expenditures are exceeding our revenues in each of those years. Important to note that shown on the slide, historically, you've increased over the past 10 years, you've increased water rates by about 2.6%. But again, these are projections of what we talked about in the past in terms of revenue adjustments. One item I really want to drive home this evening is that we're going to come back with some recommendations that will talk holistically about revenues on the system. So we'll be looking again at fire line charges, wholesale rates. So when we talk about percentage increases, these aren't necessarily just increases that are going to come from user rates. And I think that's important to note. So we're holistically looking at how do we solve this going forward. So similar forecast on the sewer side. I won't go through all the gory details, but you can see again the operating costs, the existing debt, future debt. You do have more debt obviously on the sewer side. So those green bars are bigger. But we're seeing a similar result in terms of shortfalls, given the projected revenues going forward, we are showing some annual shortfalls on the sewer side as well. They're a little bit more substantial than on the water side. But when we go to the next slide, you can see you're starting with a better net position on the sewer side. So given this forecast of revenue increases on the sewer system, we would go negative by fiscal year 29, and then obviously we would stay negative if we went forward with just adjusting the user rates based on the table here shown on the slide. Historically, you've done about 4.4% increase in sewer rates over the last 10 years. And again, I want to drive home the point that we're going to be coming back looking holistically at the revenues for the sewer system as well. And so we'll come up with some recommendations on how to solve this going forward on that holistic basis.
So if I could interrupt you, David, I mean, that 4.4% increase is something that is, it's realizing that we absorbed $100+ million treatment plant and another $60+ million in sewer improvements. So it was managed very well, and it kept those rate increases, stable. However, we're at a point now where obviously what was projected out needs to be adjusted.
Thanks, Peter. All right, so now we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about cost of service, and this just looks at from whom do you collect your revenues and how do they align with the cost of providing that service. So just in terms of your customer classes, on the next slide, we've got the number of customers. Oh, I'm sorry. A little bit more about cost of service. Sorry. One more.
One more.
Thanks. So again, the goal of the cost of service is to make sure that we're appropriately recovering our costs from your customer classes. So making sure that residential revenues match the cost to serve residential customers. On the water system, really what drives your cost is the demands as well as the peaking demands that customers place on the system. So when somebody irrigates or places a higher peak demand on the system, that generally causes you to incur more costs. On the sewer side, it's more related to the flows that they're sending and the loadings, so the strength of the sewage that they send. So those factors play into the cost of service analysis. So the next slide shows your current customer classes. On the water side, you've got residential customers, commercial, industrial, municipal, and then 2 categories of irrigation customers. So these are all tracked, and you can see the number of customers you have. On the sewer side, there's 4 customer classes. You've got residential, commercial, industrial, municipal. Under both water and sewer, you can see that residential customers make up the vast majority of your customers. But when we look at the next slide, which shows the usage by each of the customer classes, you can see that while residential is the largest number of customers, they're not the largest user. That would actually be your commercial customers. On the water side, they make up about 44% of the volume on the system. On the sewer side, about 43%. Then it would be residential, our next largest user, and then industrial, and then you can see the small slices for irrigation customers. Next slide. So this is really the key takeaway for the cost of service analysis. This is where we look at, under our current year, fiscal year 26, when we look at how much revenue we're collecting from each of the customer classes, and then what does it actually cost to serve the customer class. We can see the comparison there. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that there is some modest misalignment. So the blue bars is your current revenue, so how much we anticipate collecting from these customer classes in fiscal year 26. And then the light blue bar is the cost to serve. So you can see there's a little bit of a misalignment for each of the customer classes. But it's well within the industry norm of 10% plus or minus. So we don't see anything that's drastically out of alignment. But when we come back with some recommendations, we will make sure we're factoring in this fact. So if we're under collecting from one class, we'll look at how could we potentially adjust the rate structure to make sure that's better in alignment. But again, nothing's standing out as significantly out of alignment. It's just that we want to make sure we stay within those industry standards. All right, so the last piece is the rate design. And this is really where we'll focus the next meeting, coming back with some specific recommendations on the rate design, but I wanted to just provide a little bit of background first. So in terms of your current rate structure, so currently how you charge for water and sewer service, on the water side, you have a water monthly fixed charge, and that fixed charge is a charge that whether you use any water or not, you're charged that. If you're out of town, you're charged that. And it does scale based upon your meter size. Then your water and sewer usage charges are based upon metered water use. You bill per unit. 1 unit is 748 gallons. You have a 2-tiered structure for both water and sewer. So for 0 to 10 units per month, you pay one rate, and then once you go over 10 units, you pay a higher rate for both water and sewer. If you're an irrigation customer, there's 3 tiers. So you pay one rate from 0 to 10, another rate from 10 to 20, and then once you go over 20, you pay a higher rate. But you do step through each of those blocks, their tiers, based upon how much water you're using. So just a little bit more detail. This is how you currently charge. These are the actual charges as they stand right now for fiscal year 26. Again, I mentioned you have your fixed charge. Oops, we go back. You have your fixed charge that scales by meter size. You can see as your meter gets bigger, you pay a higher fixed charge. And then these are the actual usage rates. You don't have a fixed charge on the sewer side, although that's very common in the industry to actually have one. So one of the findings I mentioned earlier, or observations, was that your fixed charges are well below industry standards or industry norms. The reality is that a large portion of the city's cost of providing water and sewer service is fixed. So if you think about it, you've got to maintain the pipes, you've got to run the plants, you've got to pay the debt service regardless of whether somebody uses water or sewer service or not. And that fixed charge that you currently have in place, it's basically $5 for your typical residential customer. It's remained that level for the past 24 years, so you haven't increased it for quite some time. It currently generates, on the water side, about 7% of your revenues. Typical industry standard norm, what rating agencies like to see, bond rating agencies, would be in that 15 to 30%. That's more guaranteed revenue on the system, provides more stability. And also we would recommend, just in terms of the actual scaling that you're currently using, we would recommend looking at how you're scaling those fixed charges. The idea of scaling is that if you're a large metered customer, you can demand a lot more water on the system and generate a lot more sewer, and therefore your proportionate that you should pay in those fixed charges should scale proportionally. So it's important that we evaluate that. But again, extremely low in terms of your fixed cost recovery, extremely low in terms of revenue generated from your current fixed fees. The last component I wanted to talk about was just how customers use water. As I mentioned, you've got tiers currently. This is the residential usage. This is the number of customers. How many customers fall into tier 1 and how many fall into tier 2. So you can see the vast majority of your customers that are residential really never come out of tier 1. 92% of them fall into tier 1. About 8% fall into tier 2. So that's just a distribution of how customers are currently falling in your current tiers. Commercial, a little bit different. About 60% fall into tier 1, 40% fall into tier 2. So a little bit more of a wider spread there. When we look at the next customer class, which is industrial, about 54% falls into tier 1, and then about 46 falls into tier 2. You can see the distribution. You have some industrial customers that don't use very much water, and then you have some that use quite a bit. So wide distribution when it's industrial. And then finally, the distribution, you have 3 tiers for irrigation. Even though you have these higher tiers, about 82% of your irrigation water falls into that first tier, so 0 to 10. 11% falls into tier 2, and then 7% falls into tier 3. And I say all this just to kind of foreshadow, as we're looking at how you actually structure your rates and looking at the distribution, that be one of the key items we look at. So just some key observations in the usage charges. As I mentioned, majority of metered water usage does fall into the first tier, 0 to 10 units, particularly for residential. We do want to make sure that you're sizing those tiers appropriately, so we will be coming back with some recommendations to align how we structure those tiers with goals and objectives. One potential option, just to foreshadow, would be you could potentially make a smaller tier, so maybe it's 0 to 5 and then 5 to 10 to provide maybe an affordable lifeline rate. That's becoming pretty common around the country. So you size the first quantities of water at a lower rate based upon necessity, indoor water use, things of that sort. So we'll be looking at that as well. So summary of findings, again, as we've shown, water revenues are not keeping up with expenditures in the system. We do believe that revenue adjustments will be required to stabilize the funds. It's pretty pressing on the water side. You have a little bit more time on the sewer side. One item that I didn't mention this evening is that your water rates are actually pretty low in comparison to others. So we'll talk about that next time as well. But we are seeing pressure on the water side, but fortunately, water bills are fairly low in comparison to other utilities locally and as well as nationally. I mentioned there are some modest misalignments between cost of service. We're going to address those in our recommendations. And then we talked about that your fixed fees are below the industry standards. So we will be back. The next steps are really to finish the modeling for rate structure alternatives, and those alternatives will generate more revenue, address that cost of service alignment, look at affordability in terms of pricing, as well as increased revenue stability through fixed charges. We're also in the process of evaluating all your other fees and charges, so whether it be surcharges, fire protection fees, your wholesale rates, so coming back holistically with recommendations for the meeting the needs of the system. And then the next step will be to schedule that next work session where we present those recommendations. So with that, I turn it back to the Mayor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hyder. It's great that you're here in person. Appreciate having the walkthrough on this. A couple of questions, I guess, before opening up to the group that I had. One, it would be helpful to know legally what we're able to do with rates. You know, for example, with property taxes, we're gifted, you know, the ability through the state to, or granted, not gifted, granted the ability of the state to have senior exemptions and discounts like that for tax purposes. Does the state constitution have any limit on what we can do for setting fees? Understanding that, for example, could we have a low income fee that we apply, that you would apply for within the city that would give you a lower rate in the city of Portsmouth? Things of that nature would be interesting to know. Second, in the amount of data, and Mr. Hyder, really appreciate pointing out that our fees, constituent emailed us. I looked at some other, a community on the other side of the state in terms of, you know, they're kind of inverted in that they charge, instead of $4 or $5 for all of it, they charge, I think, $12 and $18 for water and sewer charge, you know, to tie into the system, and then they have lower rates. I would be interested to find out in terms of the number of participants or the number of users. It said one, you know, rate of there. I'd be interested to see like how many are zero on the residential side, or as close to zero as possible. I mean, you have a water heater, it cycles through some water, you have hydronic heat, it has to keep things going, but I would like to know how many folks are just either, you know, Airbnb-ing their house, and so they're using far less water than a regular resident, or how many people are just, you know, coming here for the weekend and not actually doing that. And is there a way that we could then structure a rate that had, you know, it was a higher fee, you know, initially, but you got to use, if you were using the water, that was credited back to you, like for, in terms of a rate usage model. So we could start, you know, focusing on those that are just buying the house as an asset, not necessarily using that house, you know, to live in, making sure that we're extracting the correct amount of money out of that to make sure that we're benefiting the rest of the residents and the residential folks that are using this and are going to feel the rate increase a lot, you know, a lot more dramatically than somebody that's, you know, not in their house and doing that. And then obviously all the commercial things in terms of tying in, you know, want to see all the different tiers that we can do, but just wanted to add those two other aspects legally. And then, you know, those that are using on the residential side almost no water, you know, how do we get the total cost there without burdening those people that are just being conservative with their water usage? All right. Any other, Councilor Bagler?
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. And to your point there, I think I'm greatly supportive of us increasing the meter fee, because what it effectively does is a low meter fee is it penalizes full-time residents and benefits part-time residents that either just spend the summers here or just weekends here, because a great deal of our infrastructure cost is just the ability to get the water there. not just the usage. So I'm glad to see that you're looking into that. One question I have is customer count class by water is 7,400 residential and sewer 5,900. We have about 10,000 residents units in Portsmouth. Why are those numbers lower than that? Is an apartment building considered one user, or would it be a number of users based on the number of apartments in that building?
That's right, it's where the water meter is essentially. So one account could be to a large building where there are a number of residents.
So to follow up on that, then, if we're using the meter fee as ability to make sure that people are not just paying for their usage, but the infrastructure costs that they incur to the city, which we all do when we have to put in new water and sewer pipes, how is there a way we can address that if somebody only has one meter? Presumably they only have one meter fee, but they're spreading it across 40 apartments. That seems unfair compared to like a single family
That's
home.
part of the scaling too, because it would be a larger meter too. That's part was Dave was talking about, is that scaling of the fees for the size meter to be able to capture that.
Okay, I would like to see us capture that as best as we can. And then my final question along this vein is we have non-town users, such as for water and sewer of surrounding towns. And I've always been opposed to the fact that they get those at wholesale. Do we have meters, or are those meters managed by those towns?
Those are metered, in Greenland, Newington, those meters are managed by us.
Oh, so if we increase the meter fee, it would increase for Greenland and Newington and other town users as well? Okay, thank you.
So we do have a couple wholesale accounts that we will be revisiting the wholesale water fees as well. So Rye, we have a wholesale account, and portion of Newcastle, we have wholesale. So we meter them, but it is a single meter, and we'll be revisiting those wholesale rates as well.
Yeah, because I feel like they're getting a discount over residents of Portsmouth, and we're giving up not only the infrastructure and the staff, but also we lose our waterfront on Pierce Island, whereas they get to maintain all their waterfront because
Sure.
they don't have the infrastructure we
Well,
have.
and-
So
and
the fact
that's-
that they get a cheaper rate doesn't sit well with me.
Understood.
Counselor Tabor. Counselor Bagley.
So, if I heard you correctly, there could be a scenario where we have a higher meter fee, and for the smallest users, if we expanded our tiers, might it be possible that a certain volume, up to a certain number of gallons, are included in that meter fee? And then for our larger customers, they pay a higher rate from the first gallon on.
Yeah, you could, it's a little bit less common. We used to see that quite a bit where you'd include some usage in the fixed charge in the meter fee. But one of the downsides of that is it does potentially discourage conservation because people realize, I'm going to be charged for this water regardless of whether I use it. So that's been one of the reasons. You just basically have to make sure that you're structuring your rates so that you're not going outside of the cost of service to serve a specific customer class. So if we set up a different rate structure for commercial or industrial, we just have to make sure that it's recovering the cost of providing their service. We can't just arbitrarily charge one customer class more than another under a different rate structure. It is, if you do include usage in the fixed charge, it's often common to scale that usage as well. So let's say we included 5 units in the fixed charge, and then you scale that up to a 4-inch meter, and there are 60 times that. Oftentimes they'll get 60 times that quantity of water to keep it on a level basis. So we just have to work through those nuances to make sure it makes sense. Because you currently actually don't have different rates for different customer classes, with the exception of irrigation. So if you're residential, commercial, industrial, everybody's basically charged the same way.
Counselor Bullock.
Thank you, Connor. And thank you very much. Appreciate having you here in person as well. You mentioned that the tiers, they could be restructured, and that could be a way of kind of having different rates, and that would conserve or encourage conservation.
Correct. Yep.
Counselor Romero, and then back to Counselor Bagley.
I know that at least you can take into account the existing customers, but do you also take into account any expansion or new development that goes on in Portsmouth? And if that's the case, how do we know what expansion or new development goes on in the communities that are outside Portsmouth? Do we know that?
Well, we track for the past 5 years, tracking sort of the ups and downs of our demands, and they've been averaging about 1% increase over the past 5 years. Last 10 years a little different because we had some large customers that are lost from the system, but for the past 5 years, we've been tracking about 1% overall. You know, we can have to use that past performance to see how things are going. We don't track it by developments and to that level. But, so that's what the model has in it right now that we're working with, that, assuming that there's a 1% increase.
So if you were getting towards how do we capture some of the fees associated with those increases?
Right, to even know that there's gonna be that increase to those fees as part of the rate structure changing.
The current rate structure has what's called the capacity use surcharge, which is a buy-in fee. And it's based on it's meter size driven. So the intent is there's a value to the asset that they're getting service from. And so like if you're a club member, you got to buy into the club, the value of that club. And that's where we're capturing some of that additional revenue out of those new developments.
Great, thanks.
As well as any improvements necessary to serve that area, the benefiting parties pay. And that's been very successful for the city.
Councilor Bagley.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So, taking this in totality, that there's a lot of drivers of cost, all the infrastructure improvements we've had to make with the 100-plus-year-old sewer pipes and things like that. The thing that we talked about a few years ago, and might be a more fair way to spread some of this burden, and I don't know if this would be part of this or not part of this, would be the stormwater overflow fee. I believe we talked about that for a couple of years, and then I guess we haven't talked about it recently. Could that be incorporated into this analysis?
So the 26 budget has money, is there a 27 budget? We're looking to, so it's a separate, it'd be a separate enterprise fund. The intent is to create a stormwater enterprise fund, and we are planning to come back to the council this next year to start talking about what that would entail, with the intent of being able to get into the 2028, FY28 budget, as it takes a number of things to get the structure in place, and then how the billing mechanism gets in place. So we have a bunch of things we have to do to set it up to be able to get there. So, and obviously before we get to that point, it's policy decisions, so you all are going to be, intimately involved in that process. So that's kind of things to look forward to. But this is, two of the three legs that we envision in the future: water, sewer, and stormwater. Currently, we have the water and sewer system funds in place. We're looking, with council approval, obviously, to establish what would be a stormwater fund as well. But that requires a lot of work and your involvement. But this one is really just looking at the water and sewer. We need to true these things up to address the market changes as well as the demographic and regulatory changes.
Thank you.
Just two more questions. When you showed the graph, and you don't need to pull it back up, but it showed revenue versus debt. The revenue is on a line that goes up and to the right, but commensurate with the debt. If we didn't take that debt on, would that revenue still go up and to the right?
Well, the revenue is based upon what we're assuming in terms of increase in revenue. So historically, last year and prior years, we've looked at what do we think you need to do to keep your revenues in line with your expenditures. So if you didn't take on the debt, you potentially wouldn't need to increase your revenues as much. So that line wouldn't have to go up as much. But that's really driven by your decisions in terms of what you do to rates going forward.
So I guess a part of this is the capital improvement plan. I guess I'm surprised to see that our sewer is in a better position from a rate standpoint, but maybe that's just because we invested in it, knew it, and, we haven't lost as much, people using toilets as industrial using water. But it would be, I guess, to look at the CIP that we approved, but has not yet been signed it isn't signed on the budget until June. But to understand, working with this, if there's any, if there are any revisiting of that given in terms of the years that those are allocated into right now, given, you know, what will have to be a rate study and change to the rate, changes to the tiering, et cetera, you know, but ultimately to revenue. So it would be helpful to know if there's any feedback on that. I see, you know, the two ones, you know, one is, you know, and both are in, you know, right now in out years. And so, you know, to know, you know, where exactly, at least on the water side, where they would be, and if we move those, if that would have an immaterial impact, you know, negatively or positively on the rates that we need to get to. Oh, sorry, Councilor Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your question spurred another question for me. If we get to a stormwater utility in 3 years, some of the debt service and the projects that are currently in the debt service under sewer are likely to move to that stormwater utility, which will force us to kind of reevaluate these rates in the way that we're addressing them now. Do we have a plan in place for how we're going to do that? Because clearly this is an analysis we're doing every 10 years.
So the stormwater program is treated as a separate special revenue fund at the moment. None of the capital projects in the sewer are stormwater projects.
Okay.
So they're standalone in the special revenue fund, and a portion of sewer rates do go to pay those debt fees. It's a 50-50 split right now. So your point is correct in the sense that if we create the enterprise fund and reduce we take that 50% coverage for the stormwater from the sewer enterprise fund, we would see an adjustment as a result of that, but they would not be the capital projects that are shown currently in the sewer enterprise fund. They would be the standalone stormwater projects. But there would be a benefit, but I wouldn't, there aren't, the stormwater enterprise projects are in, a fraction, a very small amount compared to the 77 million. I mean, where are we at right now with identified maybe 4 million?
Because there have been quite a few stormwater projects have been deferred, and I think that's because we have 82 miles of stormwater pipe, and it's not long-lived pipe, so it's a challenge.
But they haven't been identified and put into the capital plan at this point. The goal has been to create a revenue source so that we clearly attribute the cost for these projects to areas that are more equitable in terms of how they're covered. Because currently, they're born. A lot of the large stormwater sources are from nonprofit areas or disproportionate sizes of property that you don't capture the cost associated with that equitably.
So I guess my follow-on is then, so we can't capture the half of the sewer separation that is dedicated to stormwater. Because usually when we do sewer separation, we're running stormwater lines too.
So I guess if you're saying by creating the stormwater enterprise fund, we would get that reduction to the sewer enterprise fund. But my point is that the capital costs identified currently are insignificant compared to the sewer capital costs. So yes, you would see a savings, but you would not see, it would not offset the rate structure that we're, these rate increases that we're, looking at.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just one follow-up, I guess. We're not, generally the city hasn't adopted a multi-year rate plan. So we're going to come back with rate recommendations. Generally, you adopt an increase for 1 year, and then each year you're evaluating the needs of the system. So my guess is if there's less pressure in future years, because you now have a stormwater enterprise fund, you just wouldn't have to do as much of an increase on the sewer side. So I don't want you to think that it's locked in terms of as those potential costs come away from sewer, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thank you again, Mr. Hyder. Great presentation.
Appreciate
the work. All right. That was pretty much the question and answer. We'll open it up to public comment now, unless there's other questions the council had while you're thinking. Anything's fair game. we talked about tonight? All right. Oh, public comment, yep. Yep, just come to the podium, state your name.
Esther Kennedy, 41 Pickering Ave. I have heard David numerous times over the years, and I guess I'm a little disappointed that we're here. We have had a steady increase in our water and sewer. And so I have to ask why. Yes, as Peter said, we had a $1.2 million project. We had a $77 million, $62 million project for sewer. We did do the valves on the water system. I've been told that that's enough. However, it's interesting to hear you say that we still have to look at the lines. I did not hear anything about the migration from the Superfund site, the Tolan site, to our water, but I'm sure that's in there too. But one of the things I'd ask you to look at, if we're looking at this holistically, is the fact that if you look at the projects, or if you look at the budget, we have added a lot of middle management into these funds. We are splitting positions, we're adding them out of the general fund. I've often felt that it's one way to relieve the general fund, throwing them into the water and sewer, partitioning them out. So I ask you to really look at 10 years. If we're looking at 10 years here, now I know David has come more often than 10 years, but if we're saying this is going to be our 10-year plan, I would look at where you were 10 years ago with supports in the budget and where you are now. Because technically we shouldn't be much difference, but in looking at the budget, we are. So I would encourage you to do that. The other thing I would ask is that you have $197 million and $525,000 in net property growth. Where does that fit in this holistic project? How much is that changing our sewer and water rates? Because if we're claiming it as such a great thing in our tax impact, then we should be claiming it as a great thing in our water and sewer rates. And I didn't see that. I would also ask you to look at really what do we need to do to make sure that we are aligned in making sure that our sewer plants are in good condition and our water plants are in good condition. Maybe we need to look at a CIP. We know we look at it for 5 years out usually, but maybe we need to look at longer in this situation. Because we have been adding percentages. I mean, we've been seeing a lot of increase in our water and sewer bills. So why are we here now saying that we have a problem? Because I heard years ago that we were doing all this because we had a huge increase when David first joined and came and presented to us. And I was on council at that point. And it was really hard to tell our citizens why they were getting this huge increase. And it was because we were aligning the plan. We were making a long-term plan. Well, it doesn't seem like that long-term plan was sufficient. So I ask you, if we're doing a 10-year plan, what are the 10-year needs of these plants? And so we can be truthful to our community. And lastly, at one point, we did really try to keep the rate lower and steady for people. And we were trying to get people to conserve. And we didn't want to have a base rate. Actually, I almost had the votes not to have a base rate. And David's smiling because we worked hard. I did that. So that if people were conserving, we would celebrate that. We need to figure out a way to celebrate it. We don't need to sit here and say, we want you to use more water so our rates are less. That's not right, folks. And that's what I heard tonight. If we had bigger water users, bigger sewer users, our rates would be less. That's not the right direction, in my mind, if we're really thinking about environmentally friendly. So how are we going to change that? I'm leaving it all to you, but those are my basic startup questions for the fact that we're looking at a holistic approach. I appreciate that. And I can't wait to hear the next segment. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. I don't know if we did hear that we're looking for more water users tonight. We did hear that we have less water used now than we've had in previous years, and that's putting pressure on the system. But still ask that for those users that are not using any water, at all, because they don't live here either full-time or, even part-time or it's an Airbnb, that we find a way to capture that amount of usage. Anybody else for public comment?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and councilors. Peter Somsich, Sweat Avenue. First, I want to commend some of the comments that I heard today. For example, I think the idea of having lower tiers for lower consumers, I think is really a great one. The lowest tier right now is from 1 to 10 units. I have been using over the past 25 years between 2 and 4 units per month. So, and I'm not extremely conservative about water use. I'm just normal about it, and I think, and that doesn't capture the fact that I'm using much less water. Now, the city has also, I want to commend them as well, and the Public Works and others who have been pushing us to use less water. Low flow toilets, low flow showers, because water is a precious commodity. I mean, people are predicting worldwide that water is going to be the next oil. You want to conserve it. You want to use as little as possible and use it as efficiently as possible. The other thing I'd like to say is I think the idea of maybe having a monthly sewer charge is also a good idea. I haven't thought it all the way through, and also looking at the other towns that we service, whether by wholesale prices or by special deals with them, is also good. But I want to start by focusing on the fact that for residents, water is a life need. We live here, we need water. They are the majority of users, as we can see. Okay. Now, we often saw the number of users, but we didn't see a graph that said how much do those people use, those 5,000 people, versus the 400 or 700 people that are not residents. What do they use? I'm suspecting you use a lot more than the residents. Okay, hotels, hospitals, all these facilities. And the thing is, those units, like the hospitals and the hotels, they are going to be constantly trying to push down their water use, because for them that goes to the bottom line of their profits. They're going to be doing that, and they can. Residents can't do a whole lot. You just, and I think we heard on a number of occasions that the resident use for water and sewer is pretty much stable, because people are not saying, oh my gosh, the sewer rate went down, so I'm going to go to the bathroom twice every day more than I used to do it. You don't do that. Or you drink more water. Let's let the tap run just because it's cheap. People don't do that. This is crazy talk. Okay. So, but businesses will say, in a hotel, for example, they'll tell you, okay, maybe you don't want to have your towels washed all the time because it's going to save us money. Of course, they say it's going to save the environment, but for them, it's going to save water. Okay. And the same is with sewer. They have a real incentive because they are a for-profit business, and they're going to do everything possible to reduce the costs. And that's what they do. That's normal. Okay, we should expect that. That means we're going to see lower water use dramatically from commercial industrial users, because for them that really pays off. Residents can't do a whole lot. So I ask you to consider residents very differently than everybody else who's a for-profit entity. The second thing I want to say is the quality of the water is also important. You don't need drinking water to irrigate a golf course, okay? That's ridiculous, because every time you process the water, you add more value to it. And just to have gray water put on a golf course is perfectly adequate, and you don't need to use drinking water. So somehow we need to differentiate between the quality of the water that we're providing for irrigation and other uses that are not potable versus what residents need. Because I think we'll find that the quantity we're talking about is dramatically different for big users of golf courses and non-drinkable sources than it is for the residents. So I just want to highlight the fact that we need to differentiate between what residents' needs are, their life essential, versus an entity that just generates profit, whether it's a restaurant or a hotel or a hospital. For them, it's a cost of business. They can deduct it, for example. They make profit off of it, and they will conserve. And so I think these are the things worth considering, and the quality of the water itself that we provide is also of great importance. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Great points in there. I would add that we did, or Mr. Hyder did call out the usage by class in this presentation that will be available online.
Hi, Peter Huda. In listening to the presentation tonight, I heard Mr. Hyder say a lot about fixed cost. So what I want you to consider, and I'm trying to understand how this comes in, but there's a big variable cost that also comes in here that's being paid by this. And that is considered in every year on your apportioned salaries that are apportioned out of the general fund and different funds into all of these funds, specifically water and sewer. Now, I want to call this to your attention because the staffing levels funded through these appropriated salaries have increased steadily. The number of positions rose in FY21 from 41 to now 49 positions are being apportioned. Over the same period, the total salaries increased approximately 2.82 million to now it's at 4.53 million. That's an increase of over 1.4 million. So I really would like to know how this is being accounted for. This is a variable that is constantly changing, but in this case, it's constantly increasing. The effect that that had on water and sewer here, as far as salary allocations go, from 21 to 26, there was a 36.5% increase in the amount of I call them allocated, apportioned salaries that were going in to different accounts out of the general fund, mostly. So I think that's a big, these numbers are big. So the variable cost here plus the fixed cost, old accounting stuff, makes up the big part of this. So I would like to know how you're going to account for that. And this is one thing that the council does have a lot of control over. So if you need to know where this is in all of your budget books, and this is called apportioned salaries, and in 26 it's on page 181, and it tells you how much of each salary goes to different departments. And there has been a substantial increase in both of these areas, and also in stormwater. So please look at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Any other speakers for public comment? Let's see any on Zoom. None on Zoom. This begins the budget process. Appreciate again the work that went into the presentation. Nathan, the work that went in on this. A lot of time and effort will be spent on this. Petra's comment is definitely linked in terms of the budget and being able to understand, how those fixed costs, which are salary employees, continue on. Understanding on the water or the sewer side where those exist. It looks like if I was to net some of this out, it looks like we're in a little stronger position from the sewer standpoint. And I know a lot of those, apportioned salaries have come from there. The water side, because there is less water being used, which is, I just want to repeat that a little bit because the amount of times that we've, I think, fielded a lot of questions that we're running out of water. And I would agree with Esther in that, we don't want to be in a position where we're creating an incentive for people use more water. But I think of all the Think Blues, I think of DPW at the science fair with the golf balls and the toilet. You know, there's a lot of work that goes into educating our populace, our citizens about, you know, reducing water. So we've done such a good job, though, in some of the industrial things that have fallen off. We're using less water than we used to. That's going to have impacts as well. Trying to figure out the tiers in a way that's going to make it so that we all collectively manage this resource together is the goal. Making sure that we're able to do so frugally and understanding that this is a life source, and I think that was Peter that said that. People depend on this. It is literally probably one of the biggest reasons we have government is to provide these services, water, sewer, to our folks. So appreciate the effort that's paid on it. I'm glad that it's in this part of the budget and look forward to the future conversations. So with that, thank you. Good night, Portsmouth.